Okay, this is the lecture for chapter 2. Um, as you can see, I'm out in the backyard here of the Czech campus because my internet at home is not working. So I came over to the Czech campus and I'm just sort of under those trees out behind the building. It's pretty pleasant. You may hear a little noise from traffic and so on. So, yeah, hopefully my internet at home will be restored soon and I won't have to drive to town to record these lectures. But anyway, that's what I'm doing today. And I hope that you had time to watch the other lecture for chapter 1. If you didn't, it's in the content module and will be there forever. But you should go ahead and watch that. And after you watch that lecture and this lecture, write a question based on the lectures. So yes, there is content in the go away in the textbook, but in our discussion periods, which I hope are going to happen on Friday morning, assuming everything goes as planned, from 11 to 11:50, we're going to talk about stuff from the lecture more than from the text. So be sure to watch the lecture video. You can look at the PDF of the lecture if you want to. Also in the content modules for each chapter. Sometimes there's slides at the end of the PDF that I don't discuss in the lecture. So you kind of need to see the lecture in order to answer some of the quiz questions, for one thing, and also in order to write a question that pertains to the lecture and not just to the text. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to go to my PowerPoint about chapter 2. This is the PowerPoint that I show when we're having class in person. Okay, but as I said, there's a PDF of all my lectures in the content module for each chapter. Okay, so chapter 2 is about the purposes and functions of art, which is something that I didn't think about when I was starting as an artist. I just assumed that everything I did had a valid function and that there wasn't any need to justify its function. But it has sort of helped me to think about to think about, what they are. And the book does a good job of laying them out. So I'm going to follow the text pretty closely, but add some works of art that are not in the text. Okay, but this one is, I'm pretty sure. So one of the most obvious purposes of art is just making things, nice things to use on a sort of daily basis. And that's what we call design. Industrial design. So you can get a degree in industrial design and learn how to make beautiful things for the home. And I mean, you could say, I don't have mine here, but you could say that a smartphone is an example of industrial design, and that some of them are really beautiful. Software can be beautiful, etc. In this case, though, we have a sauce boat, or what we would call in the South probably a gravy boat. And, this is for the Thanksgiving or Christmas table. The gravy goes in the bowl, and then there's a nice matching ladle where the little, if you see the little cutout on the handle of the ladle, it matches the shape of the bowl and of the little petals that kind of come up on the top of the bowl. So it all kind of goes together beautifully, and that's an example of good design. And if you get to the Museum of Modern Art in New York ever, go to their shop and see all. They have actually have a whole gallery of this kind of art for everyday use. But they also have a gift shop where you can buy, copies of things in their galleries. So this is something that most people have probably done, embellishment. So embellishment is just decorating something that you use in your everyday life. Like if you've ever taken a plain white t-shirt and tie-dyed it, then you embellished it. And in this case, we have um, what's called resist dyed cloth, where the design is drawn onto the cloth with a resist. In this case, a paste made out of a type of potato called a cassava. So there's this kind of paste that um, Nigerian artists use to draw on the fabric, and that blocks the dye. So then after the resist paste dye dries, they dip the whole thing in a bucket full of indigo dye and then do that repeatedly. And wherever you see white on the design is where the potato starch was, the cassava paste. And where we see blue is where the dye was able to penetrate because there was no cassava paste there. So that's pretty cool. It's something that I've done in my work as a fiber artist, not with that exact substance, but with other kinds of resist, mainly wax actually for batik. But you can see that this was just a plain white piece of cloth, which would be kind of boring as a skirt or a tablecloth or whatever these sort of cloths could be used for. But once you embellish it with all these incredible designs, it becomes beautiful and interesting. Maybe I should show you a piece of weaving on my hat that I made years ago. So I made this little hat band back in the 90s. I've kept up with it for 25 years, all these years. And I could have just made a plain woven band for this hat. But instead, I made this. I'll come a little closer to the camera. I made this design based on Peruvian weaving designs that somebody was teaching us how to do. And I forgot the name of it, but it's supposed to look like an eye. Let me see if it's a little bit faded now. Anyway, it's not plain. It's slightly embellished, you could say. Okay, another purpose of visual art, you could say, is just plain old visual delight, as your text puts it, which is kind of obvious. Like, of course you want art to look nice, but maybe that's not so obvious anymore because a lot of contemporary art is not like that. But, for most of human history, visual art was made to look good. And I still try to make things look good. I don't know about other contemporary artists, but I like for my art to look good. The Greeks were definitely into that. And their version of it was a kind of idealism, really. Since I don't have a whiteboard, I probably should just make little cards and hold them up with the words on them. Or I could put them in the chat. Well, let's see if I can do that now. Oops. I meant the Zoom chat. Let's see. I don't know if you can. Let me see if I can access. No, when I'm screen sharing, I can't see the chat. Anyway, maybe I'll be able to figure that out later. But idealism is just an idea about, what would be, in this case, an ideal young man? What would an ideally beautiful young man look like? And this is what the Greeks thought he would look like. He would be perfect. So maybe there weren't any actual young men, 20-somethings in ancient Greece that were whose features were this perfectly symmetrical and who looked this, kind of pretty like this. But that was what their art was about. It was about ideal humans, not regular, real, sort of imperfect humans. And similarly, in the period following the European Renaissance in Europe, landscape painting was frequently about ideal landscapes. So in this case, the artist that art historians refer to as Claude, that was his first name, but we don't call him Lorraine, we just call him Claude, sort of like Michelangelo. Anyway, this is an example of a typical Claude landscape that includes, a Greek or Roman ruin of some sort that you see on the left, and then a far horizon, usually with some kind of water and a dramatic sky and tiny little figures who are acting out some kind of story, usually from mythology. In this case, the story is that Ascanius is shooting at this deer who has a sort of weirdly long neck. And he didn't know that this deer was a pet deer that belonged to somebody named Sylvia, who was a princess in Italy. And he was, by killing her pet deer, he started a war with her tribe. So this is part of the ancient lore of the Romans. Weirdly, the ruin is a Roman ruin, but it wouldn't have been a ruin in the time of Ascanius. But don't worry about that. The ruin has to be there to make it look like an ideal, picturesque landscape, as it is. It's, you know, it's harmonious. It makes you feel good to look at it, even though the deer is going to die. Okay, so in contemporary art, one of the great things about contemporary art, that is art made by people who are still alive now, is that sometimes it's not that serious, particularly Jeff Koons' art. And I put this in here, the book doesn't put it in this part of the text, but I put this in here because I think that a lot of contemporary art, its purpose is visual delight, but of a sort of different kind. Like, the delight here is kind of to make you laugh on one level. Because, I mean, I actually saw this in person when I lived in Texas, and I really, at first I thought it was kind of dumb, but the more I looked at it, the more I really liked it. So what it is, it's one of Jeff Koons' balloon sculptures, and these are enormous. I mean, they can be 15 or 20 feet high. In this case, this one cost $1 million when the people that own this house that it was at bought it. And it's made out of aluminum or stainless steel or something like that. But what it represents is one of those balloon sculptures that you get if you go to a birthday party and they hire one of those people that can make little animals out of balloons. In this case, it's supposed to be a flower, a balloon flower that, you know, would normally be about this big if made out of those long balloons. But he's sort of blown it up to heroic proportions and made it out of steel and then mounted it on in a lake. Well, this is what the Beverly Hillbillies would call a cement pond. Okay, it's not very deep. It's only like 2 feet deep. It's a landscape feature. It's not for swimming or anything like that. And so there's these pilings that are down in the pool, maybe 3 or 4 of them, and the sculpture rests on top of those pilings, but it looks as if it's floating magically, like a balloon would float actually on the water. But it's huge. It's, you know, 15 feet tall. It probably weighs, I don't know, several tons. So this is, and there's something a little bit, I think, knowing Jeff Koons and his other work, there's something a little bit sexy about it. I don't know how to put this, but yes, it's a flower, but it's also kind of phallic, and it's also got something that looks a little bit like a cervix and something that looks a little bit like testicles. I mean, this is typical Jeff Koons kind of joking, you could say. So a lot of contemporary art is like this. Yes, it is kind of beautiful, but not like in an ideal Greek way or an ideal Claude landscape way. Yeah, they're using jackhammers over there. Just try to ignore that. Okay, so another purpose of visual art, conveniently and throughout history really, is storytelling. And this is actually the work of art that's on the cover of your text, the 12th edition of Art Forms. So what is the story here? Well, Cruz Villegas is a Mexican contemporary artist who grew up in the outskirts of Mexico City. And if you've ever been to a city in Latin America and maybe in other parts of the world, you know that there are what are sort of pejoratively called shanty towns around the edge of the main city. And these are neighborhoods where people have kind of built their own homes just out of whatever they could find. And sometimes these shanty towns don't actually have, you know, city provided plumbing or sewage or anything like that. People have just sort of created them. And so Cruz Villegas's purpose, as he explains it, was to tell the story of how people like his parents and other people in his family managed to create homes out of just things that they could find, concrete blocks, bits of wood, and so on. And the houses sort of expanded as needed. So if they needed more space, they just built on another room as they got more concrete blocks or bits of wood that they scavenged and so on. So that's the story he's trying to tell. And he calls this type of work autoconstrucción. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I don't speak Spanish. Also, he makes these kind of sculptures, you could call them, or assemblages out of found objects. You could say kind of junk. And look, it matches my hat, sort of. I found a feather too. He found a lot of feathers and stuck them on this rock. I mean, you know, it's up to you to kind of figure out what this is about, but I'm guessing it's more storytelling about people from his community. Again, it's sort of open-ended what it might mean, and as such, this work of art would be a good one to form a question about for your weekly question for our discussion period, because there's no one answer as to what this is about, and that's the kind of question you want. You want to write a question for which there is no one answer that, you know, everybody in the class can have a different opinion about. So think about that. Okay, so another kind of storytelling is what your book calls commentary. So commentary could be a way of telling a story about something that's not as personal. Like when we look at Cruz Villegas' work, this is pretty personal. This is about his story, his personal life, and people that he knows. But sometimes people want to tell a story about the wider world that maybe doesn't have that much to do with them personally, but it's just about. Thank you. Yeah. Are you locking up? Yeah. Okay. I'll have to stay here a little longer. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So they're not going to make me go away right away. That's good. All right. So this is a sad story that Chris Jordan, a photographer and videographer, is telling here. It's about an island in the Pacific called Midway, which you may have heard of because it was the site of an important naval battle in World War II. But on this island now, they're mainly birds. There's a few sort of things left over from World War II there, but mainly these albatross birds, which are these huge birds with a wingspan of like, I don't know, 10 feet or something. The albatross raise their chicks on this Midway island. But sadly, and they go out every day to forage for their chicks by scooping up fish and things from the Pacific Ocean to bring back and regurgitate and feed to their chicks. But it's also the site of what's called the Pacific Gyre, which is this trash pool the size of Texas. And it's called a gyre because it kind of, the ocean currents kind of make it circle in like a spiral kind of. And all this plastic from cruise ships and from various rivers in Asia mainly that empty into the Pacific Ocean. All this plastic is floating out there in the Pacific, and it's a really big trash pile. I may have said this already, but it's the size of Texas, I think I read. So the albatross birds can't tell the difference between fish and plastic. So when they're out there scooping things up with their bills, as they have for hundreds of thousands of years, they inevitably scoop up plastic, and then they come back and regurgitate that into the gullets of their chicks. And sadly, the chicks often then die. And Chris Jordan went there and found these sort of decomposed albatross chick bodies uh, with the contents of their stomach still there, because the plastic doesn't degrade. The chick may degrade, as you can see in the upper left corner, but the plastic is kind of forever, and that's what killed the chick. So there's some more information about that in the content for chapter 2, in the content module for chapter 2. There's a link to a video about that. It's a beautiful video, if somewhat sad. Okay, so another category of visual art that your book talks about is commemorative art. So commemoration has to do with remembering, remembering, a person who died or many people who died. In this case, the Vietnam War Memorial, Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, obviously is a commemorative work of art about the almost 60,000 people who died in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And I remember pretty well when this wall was new. I went to see it in 85 or 86, and even though the war had been over for 10 years, it ended in 1975. Or maybe, well, 10 years was not that long, and a lot of veterans were still fairly young men in their 30s then. And you could see veterans who had survived the Vietnam War just sobbing at this wall, with their heads on the wall sometimes. And you could see little notes that people had stuck in the cracks of the wall as sort of notes to their dead family member or something. Anyway, it's black granite that's really shiny and reflective, and the names of all the people who died in chronological order of their death are inscribed in the wall. Now, this may seem pretty normal to us now, and in fact, there's a memorial in Cookeville around the courthouse that's sort of based on this idea and is almost exactly the same in that it's names inscribed in a wall. But at the time, in the early 80s, this was considered just radically different for a war memorial, because a traditional war memorial shows, a soldier sometimes on horseback in a sort of heroic pose. This was not that, and as such, it was really controversial, so controversial that some veterans hated it, and to sort of mollify those people, they did create a more naturalistic sculpture that shows 3 soldiers that's near the Vietnam Memorial Wall. But I think over time, people have come to love this, and although it was at first really controversial, I think now its designer, Maya Lin, is recognized as a person who, yeah, yeah, okay, thanks. Oh yeah, okay. So, yeah, I think Maya Lin has gone on to create other memorials in other places that are similarly innovative and kind of abstract. And what she said was that she wanted to emphasize just the names, the reality of the people that died. And she was very young when she designed this. I think she was in her 20s. She was a undergraduate architecture student at Yale, and she was Chinese American, and that also raised a lot of eyebrows. Anyway, you should watch the video that's linked to in the content about this. And again, this is another work of art that would be really good for a discussion question. Like, I bet you could come up with a question about why she designed it this way, or why people were upset about it, or something like that. But especially after you've watched the video, that should give you a lot of ideas for a good discussion question. Okay, so I think when most people think about what is the purpose of art or what is art about, they think about this, which is, well, maybe not this exact painting, but this purpose of art, that is self-expression. That when you make art, your purpose is to express yourself as a person, your individuality. And certainly that's part of it. You know, maybe that was not the main purpose of art through most of human history. I mean, the ancient Greeks didn't really make art for self-expression. That wasn't their purpose, because artists were more like craftspeople. They were anonymous almost. But now it's definitely part of it. And certainly for Frida Kahlo, that was all about what she was about. And you know, she's one of the most famous painters that people recognize now, I think, because of her distinctive self-portraits. A lot of her work is self-portrait, and a lot of it is about pain, like in this case, because Frida, when she was 18, was in a terrible trolley accident. So a trolley is like a streetcar slash bus, sort of an electric bus, and she was riding an electric bus in Mexico City, where she lived in the early 20th century, and a truck hit the trolley, and a guardrail in the trolley, a handrail, sort of penetrated her abdomen and broke her spine. I mean, it was just a terrible accident. It's amazing that she survived it. But she did, but she was in a lot of pain for the rest of her life, and she had to wear these corsets to kind of hold herself together. You know, she represents her spine here as a broken column, like a Greek, on a Greek temple, which we'll study later. But you know, this column is cracked, it's broken. The only way the whole thing is held together is by this metal corset. And these corsets, there was an exhibit of her clothing and her corsets, I think, that I saw somewhere. I can't think where. And it was awful. I mean, the corsets just look so uncomfortable. And it's just horrible to think that she had to wear those from the time she was about 20 till she died in her mid-40s. But anyway, she did. She had to wear them like a back brace or something. But even so, she was in a lot of pain a lot of the time. And that, you know, obviously the nails that are sticking into her represent that, and tears coming out of her eyes. So, I mean, it's hard to look at this painting without almost feeling pain, your physical pain yourself. So she really, and there's this desolate, you know, background to the figure of Frida here. So, you know, it's a great example of self-expression. That is, you know, this is my life, y'all. You know, anybody who's lived with chronic pain knows what that's like. Okay, but, you know, again, self-expression was not the main purpose of art for most of human history. And one of the biggest purposes, actually, was spirituality, in some cases even worship, which this window from Chartres is a great example of. And later in the course, we'll be talking about Chartres Cathedral and what it represents and everything about it. But for now, on the left of the screen is this very old window from the 1300s that shows the Virgin Mary enthroned with Jesus on her lap, baby Jesus, who actually looks more like a man here, a little man, and a dove floating in the air over her that represents the Holy Spirit, and then angels and prophets and some of her ancestors, I think, below that in the squares below her. So um, when you visit Chartres Cathedral, you, you get this feeling of just kind of awe and reverence for Mary, who's not so important in usually in Protestant Christianity, but in Catholicism, she's extremely important. And in the 11th and 12th century, when Chartres was being built, there was a kind of cult of the Virgin. That is a cult of the Virgin Mary, and she really, for a while, for about a century, kind of eclipsed God and Jesus as objects of worship. People prayed to Mary because she was loving and compassionate and would intercede for you with God in a way that nobody else could really. So the Chartres Cathedral is like a temple to the Virgin Mary, and this window is the oldest surviving window in Chartres Cathedral. And I just think, I mean, I admit she looks a little cross-eyed here, but other than that, I think her face is just really sweet. She has this sort of half smile, and she just looks kindly. And she's wearing a crown. She's a queen, which implies she does have some power to make things better. Like, I don't know, make Frontier fix my internet, please. I'm not actually going to pray that, but you know what I mean. Okay, but um, not all art that's spiritual is religious. Some of it is just about spirituality, or what we might call experiences that sort of inspire us and uh, sort of take us out of our everyday lives and troubles to something bigger and more cosmic. And that's the purpose of Nancy Holt's work of what's called land art, sun tunnels. So the 70s were a time of land art in the West, and Nancy Holt was one of its practitioners. So she took these big concrete pipes and lined them up with, so that some of them point to the sunrise of the winter solstice, and some point to the sunset of the winter solstice, and some point to the sunrise of the summer solstice, and some point to the sunset of the winter solstice. So when we get to Stonehenge, that's kind of what Stonehenge does in a different way. So it's like she was building a new sort of Stonehenge. But in addition, there are holes in the pipes for light to shine through the pipes, and these holes create kind of like constellations on the inside of the pipe. So you can sit inside the pipe and look at these little lights reflecting on the inside of the pipes. And what she said about this work of art is that the American West for her, and just the sky and the landscape, is a kind of spiritual experience, just this huge spaces in the American West. And I think that's really true. I've been out there when I lived in Texas, and it's so flat in a lot of the places, and the sky just seems to be this gigantic bowl over this flat plain that you're standing on, and the sky is always changing, and it's at night it's just this incredible thing where you can see literally billions and billions of stars, like Carl Sagan said. So there is a kind of spiritual experience to being in these vast spaces in the American West. Okay, so some art is blatantly political, we could say. A lot of contemporary art is. But um, your book sort of separates political art into two kinds. Persuasive art, which I think they mean is art commissioned by governments to persuade you to kind of obey, so to speak. And then the other kind is protest art, which is obviously the opposite. But let's just look at official persuasive art from, you know, the man, the authorities. So a lot of it's graphic art too. That means like posters, advertisements, things like that. And in this case, we don't really see that many posters in cities anymore because now we have screens that we look at ads and other types of propaganda. We see them on screens, on television, on our internet screens, and so on. But before there were screens, before there was TV or anything like that, there were posters plastered all over the walls of cities. I mean, even in the 90s, I remember in Houston, the first picture I ever saw of Beyonce was a poster about a concert or a record or something when she was still in Destiny's Child. That shows you how far back I go. Anyway, yeah, there were still posters on city walls in Houston in the 90s. I don't know if there still are. I mean, they were 2 or 3 feet tall. They weren't like billboards. But, in the 20s and early 20th century and even in the late 19th century, graphic art in the form of paper posters that were plastered on walls was a common way to get information across for governments and companies and advertisers and so on. In this case, this is a poster from World War I. It's a recruitment poster where the Secretary of War in England, Lord Kitchener, is pointing his finger at you, a male Briton or resident of Great Britain, and demanding that you join your country's army in order to preserve England from the invasion of the Hun or the Germans. Germans had already invaded Belgium and France, and not too long after that happened, Great Britain joined France and Belgium to try to get the Germans out of France, and that resulted in World War I, which went on from 1914 to 1918. And this was an extremely effective recruitment poster. First of all, the pointing finger and the eyes of Lord Kitchener are impossible to avoid. It may be hard to tell in this slide, but in the actual poster, you couldn't avoid him. Like if you went to the left or to the right, it still appeared as if Lord Kitchener was staring at you and pointing at you and demanding that you sign up. And it was so effective that other countries copied the design. This is a Russian recruitment poster for the Red Army from the later, after World War II in the 20s. It says, have you joined the Red Army? And then, of course, the United States also copied that design with Uncle Sam in Lord Kitchener's place, also pointing at you. I want you for the U.S. Army. I'm sure you've seen this image. And then the most terrifying version of all is the German version. I want you for the Reichswehr, or German army. I would never join the army with that guy in it. He looks like a zombie. He's scary. Anyway, I think it was probably pretty effective also. I think this might have been later, like maybe from the 1930s, the Hitler era. I'm not certain. Wait, let me check my notes. 1919, I was wrong. Okay, so this is after World War II, when Germany had been pretty much defeated in World War I, and they were trying to, this is during the Weimar Republic period, and they were trying to reconstitute the army after its complete destruction in World War I. Okay, so then there's political art that comes from people resisting state power, you could say. Um, and contemporary art is just full of this stuff. Um, there, a lot of contemporary art is political, and a lot of it is what you could call protest art. So I just picked one thing. There's some others in the other things in the slides following this, which you can see if you download the PDF of the lecture, some other examples of protest art. But I'm just going to focus on this one thing, which was pretty brilliant and happened about a year ago, and that is the Teeter-Totter Wall is the name of the work, created by two artists who call themselves Rael Sanfratello. And the Teeter-Totter Wall is basically a seesaw that works through the border wall so that kids on the Mexican side of the border can seesaw with kids on the American side. And apparently it was incredibly fun for about a day before it was destroyed or taken away. So I think this is an aerial shot of how it works. So you get a better idea here of how it works. So these artists, again, in my notes it tells you what their exact name is, but they had this idea for something fun to do at the border wall. So the border wall wouldn't just be this kind of thing that divides people. Maybe it could be something that connected people. And they thought about it, and they came up with this idea of these seesaws. And they actually built or what they call teeter-totters. So they actually built these pink bits of metal that had seats on both sides that they could slip through the bars of the border wall, which, as you probably know, is not an actual wall, but a kind of a fence. And they went down there, they got these things built, the teeter-totters, and they went down there the day before, and they said, hey, kids, do you think it'd be fun if there was like a seesaw on both sides of the wall? And the kids on the Mexican side, where there's a town right near the wall, said, yeah, that sounds awesome. So then they had to go talk to some Americans on the American side, because on the American side there's not actually a town, it's just a desert. So they did recruit some American kids and adults and told them about it. And so then the next day, they'd already applied for permission to do this, and they were repeatedly just told, no, you can't do that. And finally they decided, well, is it illegal? They couldn't find any legal reason not to do it. So they just said, okay, we're just going to do this, which is frequently, I think, the best approach. Ask for forgiveness, not permission. Anyway, so on the appointed day, the next day, actually, they came down with the teeter-totters, stuck them through the wall, and people had a great time, and there was a video, and I think I linked to the video in the content. I hope I did. If I didn't, I'll fix that. And you can see people playing on the teeter-totters, and then the Border Patrol people arrive, and you think, oh no. But they just kind of photograph it, and they don't do anything, really. And then I think they demanded that the artists remove the teeter-totters. So I think it went on for about an hour, and then the border people said, okay, you've had enough fun at the wall now, take away your teeter-totters. But you can see I consider this to be a success. They made their point. The wall is ugly, the wall divides people, but art, especially something that's painted, Barbie pink, and that kids can play on, art can bridge this ugly divide and bring people together. So, mission accomplished. Okay, so that's the end of the lecture for today. I hope it didn't, I don't know how long exactly I took. And I don't know how to stop the recording. Oh, I guess, okay. I can stop the video up here. Okay, so that's all. If you have any questions about, oh, look, here's how you show the chat. Okay, so one thing you can do, hopefully if we have a discussion period on Friday, which would be, let me get rid of that and bring up a calendar. Okay, so on Friday, August 28th, which I'm pointing to here, I'm gonna schedule a Zoom discussion period, and that's not required. Like you don't. Oh, let's go to still recording. Okay, you don't have to go to come to that, but um, that's when we're going to discuss your questions. Now you do have to submit the questions. That's not optional. So submit a question about either the chapter 1 lecture or the chapter 2 lecture to the Dropbox by Thursday night, which would be August 27th. And then I'll look through those questions and I'll pick some questions to discuss on at the Zoom discussion meeting. So and I'll send an invitation to that. So if you can come to that discussion via Zoom, that's great. If you can't, and if you do, you get an extra 5 points on your weekly question grade. But if you can't come to that, you can't come to it. If you're work or whatever, don't worry about it. It's optional because this is an asynchronous class. That is, you don't have to be present for all the Zoom meetings. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording and I'll see you later. Bye.